Thank you all for coming to this is our third Judaic Studies event for the semester. So we're very happy to have you all here. We have an interesting program tonight. First, we're going to hear from, I'll introduce him in a second, Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody. He'll speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to, on Jewish perspectives, and then we're going to hear from Patrick Clark of the university. He's going to speak response or different perspectives, Catholic perspectives. And the title of the talk is Jewish Ethical Perspectives on Civilian Casualties in War, A Tale of Two Sieges. Now, Rabbi Brody lives in Jerusalem, but he comes to America a lot, so we're very fortunate to have him here. His professional life is focused a lot on issues of medical ethics. In fact, he also wrote a column in the Jerusalem Post for many years, which I guess maybe is the equivalent of the ethicists that the New York Times has, that sort of thing. A number of years ago, he started working on a book on Jewish military ethics. Unlike the Catholic tradition, that there's a whole just war tradition, Jews never had an army, at least for thousands of years, so they didn't really develop these ideas. But in the last 75 years or so, there's been discussions of it, and he writes this book, which under normal circumstances would have been read by people like me and intellectuals, others. But then, of course, October 7th happens, and now he has the book that comes out right then, and all the issues that you hear about, the news, ethics of war, he's now being asked to speak everywhere. So we're very fortunate that in your busy schedule, you're able to come speak to us today. And the topic you're going to speak about, civilian casualties in war. I mean, if he doesn't mention it, I'll mention it. I mean, if you follow the news, obviously, you know this is a big issue, and it's an issue in Ukraine, it's an issue all over, but obviously the war, Israel and Hamas, especially since, and I'm sure you'll speak about this, is a different sort of war, those who follow it. It's not two armies, it's people who merge in with the civilian population. In fact, I'll go even further, that it makes it more complicated because the war, it's probably the first army in history, first government in history that actually wants casualties on their own side. They place their people in a certain way. And so that also raises issues. What's Israel's responsibility? If Hamas doesn't care about the civilians, what's Israel's responsibility? And in terms of war, when always civilians are an issue. So we'll hear Rabbi Brody's perspectives as a thinker on this, followed by our own Dr. Clark, who's an expert in Catholic social teaching. And we'll see there might be some divergence in perspectives here, which will be nice. And then we'll have time for a few questions afterwards. So without any further ado, Rabbi Brody.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Professor Shapiro, for those kind words and invitation, and looking forward to a great conversation. So as you mentioned, I do live in Israel. I'm originally not Israeli. I grew up in Houston, Texas. And obviously lots been going on over the last, 18 months now. I don't intend to really be speaking directly about the current war, although it's obviously in the background, and not just in the background. It's on everyone's mind, certainly people in Israel and people following what's going on in Israel. But of course, it's relevant for other conflicts as well. The issues I was speaking about tonight, certainly in the Russia and Ukraine and other conflicts around the world. And for that matter, many conflicts that the United States and Britain and others have been involved in. One of the things that I think is really important to think about when you think about the ethics of war is for many people in the West, this has been a very interesting, theoretical conversation for a long time. And the reason is that people in the West haven't really had wars fought on Western territory for many, many years. And of course, I'm aware of 9/11 and aware of other incidents, but it wasn't actually a full-blown war. And so it's very important to recognize the fact that when you think about the ethics of war, this isn't like an ivory tower conversation. This is something which is happening in practice. And so I want to try to do is to give a little bit of what I take a Jewish take on these issues. I don't mean to say it's the Jewish version of it, right? There are other versions out there. But I'll try to give a framework of thinking about some of these dilemmas. And I want to do so through a story, through a tale of two sieges. Okay? I'm going to tell you a story that happens in 1982, and a big debate that happens in rabbinic circles and other circles as well, to try to develop a bit of a framework for thinking about these issues. Now, as Professor Shapiro mentioned, I wrote this book called Ethics of Our Fighters. I wrote it for several years, And it was basically done in the summer of 2023. And a lot of things in Israel that wait till after the holidays. And of course, on the end of the holiday of October 7th, and I called them up and said, let's get the book out. We got the book out very quickly. But I wrote the book not about October 7th. The book is about ethics of war, and it's meant to be relevant to anyone, Jewish, non-Jewish alike, Israel, and other places around the world. But I want to tell you a story now, and a tale of two sieges, to try to explain a little bit of how I look at these issues. So the year is 1982. Okay? In 1982, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, have entered into southern Lebanon. The reason why Israel enters into southern Lebanon is for several years, the Palestine Liberation Organization, headed by a man by the name of Yasser Arafat, has launching terrorist raids on northern Israel, from there and from South Lebanon as well, and other places. And Israel tried to push back the PLO beyond what's known as the Litani River, the southern part of Lebanon, and unsuccessfully does so in 1978. And in 1982, I won't get to all the details now, they decide to invade Lebanon, southern Lebanon, in order to push back the terrorists off of its border. Okay? And there's a long story here, but it becomes a much more expansive raid, and not just an invasion, a pushing back operation, but turns out into a full-fledged war. And so in July 1982, a month into the war, Israel has now laid siege around the capital city of Beirut. This is a picture here you see of the siege, literally surrounding all around. By the way, in Gaza today, and certainly at the beginning of the war, there wasn't a siege initially, because a siege is when you control all four sides. Initially, certainly for many months of the current war, one of the sides was controlled by Egypt. The fact that Egypt didn't open its border to let in refugees is a great scandal, but not for now. But in Beirut, they actually had a siege around the city. And a great rabbi, a rabbi of distinguished military history, a rabbi who'd been involved in some of the most famous incidents, military incidents of the Israeli society, including the liberation of the Western Wall in 1967. The man on the bottom right here was now become the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Shlomo Brody, gets up and proclaims and says, it is an obligation of Jewish law that the IDF does not hermetically seal, does not lay a full-fledged siege around Beirut, but is obligated to allow people to leave. You have to create evacuation corridors because Jewish law requires to let people leave a city. Now, if you think about this for a minute, sieges are the oldest method of warfare in the book. Right? How do people lay sieges throughout history? How do people fight war throughout history? Create a siege. Right? And so people look at Rabbi Brody and say, hello, do you not know how sieges work? The whole way sieges work is you have to surround all four sides. And if you don't surround on all four sides, what are you doing? Not a siege. And the man on the top right, another distinguished rabbi in Israel, by the name of Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli, says, Rabbi Brody, you don't know what you're talking about. And we'll get into it a little bit later on, the basis of this debate, but he says absolutely is not required. Now, this is a very interesting moment for the following reason. And one of the things I want to develop here tonight is the following. You know, people get very nervous about when you talk about religion and war, religion and violence. Why? Because many people assume, and not without reason, that when you combine religion and war, what does that lead to? Fundamentalism. Right? It leads to a more vibrant, more exaggerated type of violence, and they get very nervous about this combination. And here you have a chief rabbi, a man of distinguished military history, who'd been the chief chaplain of the army for many years, coming and saying, we need to allow the civilians, and anyone else for that matter, to leave the city in order to reduce civilian casualties. And I want to understand where this comes from. Now, sometimes people say, well, there's a vision in the Bible of the swords into plowshares, right? I have a picture of the Isaiah wall and the dream for peace. This is from the UN, right? This sort of idyllic, messianic vision. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall learn war anymore. This is a very nice idea, of course, and it's certainly an aspiration, but that verse comes up in the book of Isaiah. It also comes up in the book of Micah, and 8 verses later, it also speaks about, for I will give you horns of iron and provide you with hooves of bronze, and you will crush the many people. Meaning even the Bible itself understands, well, we might have a messianic vision of a repaired world, of a world without war, which we should all be aspiring for. Let's put it out there. But the reality of warfare is there. And so then you have to ask, well, what exactly are the ethics that should govern our behavior? And so Rabbi Goren here on the left side here says, it follows out all types of war and siege. It is forbidden to close the besieged city from all sides. And this is a bona fide law. And he quotes here, actually, interestingly enough, from the biblical story of Jacob and Simon and Levi, where the sons of Jacob, Simon and Levi, destroy a city of Shechem in the book of Genesis, chapter 34. And he says that this is a great desecration of the name of God. In Hebrew, we call this a Chilul Hashem, a desecration of the name of God to indiscriminately kill. And then he says something very important. And to a certain extent, this obligation of not desecrating the name of God, of having mercy on civilians, falls on the rabbis of Israel, because the principle of mercy is found in the Torah and the Bible and the halacha and Jewish law, and it is a great desecration of the name of God that people will say that we just kill innocent people along with the murderers without distinction. And so Rabbi Goren is putting a very strong statement here to say that it is a requirement to have an evacuation corridor because you have a requirement to try to minimize the killing of innocents. But let's think about this for a moment. If you have an evacuation corridor and you let people leave, who else might leave? Not just the civilians, but also the combatants, in this case, the terrorist group, the PLO, the soldiers, however you want to refer to them. And therefore, you're undermining the military efforts. And Rabbi Goren says, well, nonetheless, this is a requirement of Jewish law. And Rabbi Yisraeli, the other person I mentioned, showed a picture about earlier, gets very upset about this, man on the top there, and gets very upset and says, listen, there's no such obligation. We understand that the people who are attacking us, the terrorists of the PLO, need to be killed. They're, right, we have an obligation to kill them. You cannot let them out. And the fact that, sometimes we'll allow an evacuation corridor is a military consideration. It is not a moral obligation. Of course, he puts point number 4. We should try to let the civilians out. But if you're going to create an evacuation corridor, and that's going to undermine the military effort, then you don't do that. Because you cannot allow your enemies out of your territory. Okay, so what does the IDF do? What does the IDF do? Do they create the evacuation corridor? Do they follow Rabbi Goren, or do they follow Rabbi Yisraeli? So the IDF doesn't ask either of them, okay? In other words, the IDF doesn't work by Jewish law. They don't ask rabbis. It doesn't operate that way. But in practice, they follow the position held by Rabbi Goren and create 2 evacuation corridors. And the war goes on for 2 months. We don't know exactly how many people were killed in Beirut during those 2 months in the siege. The head of the Lebanese Red Cross was Yasser Arafat's brother. Okay, so it wasn't exactly the most reliable source of information, but we have a very good book by an American historian by the name Richard Gabriel, who wrote a book called Operation Peace of Galilee, and he says he believes that 100,000 people fled the city of Beirut through the 2 evacuation corridors. That's a lot of people who were able to flee for their lives because the IDF created this. Now, as a result, though, partly because of the end of the siege, about 14,000 PLO terrorists also were able to leave. We'll come back to this later on. And we think about 1,000 PLO fighters were killed and 88 Israeli soldiers killed during these 2 months. And his best guesstimate is about 5,000 non-combatants were killed in Beirut, with another 20,000 or 30,000 wounded. Now let's look at those numbers. That's a lot of people. That is very, very sad, tragic. But is it unethical? Because let's think about it. You're fighting another enemy who has purposely placed themselves in an urban setting of Beirut amongst their people. Today in Gaza, it's much more complicated because it's not only amongst the people, but they've built tunnels to be underneath their people. But then it was above ground. But they're fighting from an urban environment. And so the question is, given that circumstance of 2 months of fighting, is that what we call an excessive amount of fighting, of deaths, of casualties? Again, tragic. But is it unethical? Now, I'm stressing this point because for many people today, and certainly in the TikTok world, but for many, many years already, what we call the CNN effect, right? CNN was just coming about in the early 80s, and this idea, you see visions, you see pictures, and it's terrible. But is it unethical what you see on television? So here I give you analysis of a lawyer from the ICRC, the International Red Cross, who writes about this a few years later. And she says as follows: the Israeli bombardment of Beirut in June and July of 1982 resulted in high civilian casualties, but not necessarily excessively so, given the fact that the military targets were placed amongst the civilian population. In other words, what she's saying, yes, a lot of people died, but given the fact that the military targets were being placed next to civilians, it's not excessive. And in fact, there are 2 American historians, not Jews, not Israelis, I don't think they're Zionists, who wrote a book about the war called Flawed Victory. Okay, you can tell by the title, Flawed Victory, they critique the Israeli army and government for various things, but in it they write as follows. They were actually in Beirut during the war, and they write, as military historians, we can think of no war in which greater military advantages were gained in combat in densely populated areas at such a small cost in civilian lives lost and property damaged. And this despite the PLO's deliberate emplacement of weapons in civilian communities. And Rabbi Goren is thrilled. And he announces and writes an essay a year later and says, listen, it should be noted with satisfaction that the IDF acted in this way throughout the days of the siege of Beirut, which allowed anyone who wanted to flee Beirut could have saved his life and lives of his wife and child as the law requires. In other words, he says, we have sanctified the name of God, which is a very communal way of thinking about things, because we allowed civilians to get out. And then he says, and if you didn't flee, well, that is your responsibility. Meaning, once we gave you an option to flee and you chose to stay, you can't blame it then on the IDF, particularly because of the fact that the enemy here, the opposing side, fought in an urban environment. And now this is a very interesting way of thinking about things, because Rabbi Goren is trying to develop things and saying as follows. You know, a lot of times we think about ethics in the realm of individual responsibility. And one of the things about war is it's a collective entity. It's very hard to separate the individual from the collective. And this is twofold. He's saying, as a collective, as the Jewish people, as a nation, whether you're Jewish or not, whatever it might be, you have responsibility for behaving ethically, to allow civilians to get out, but also recognize the fact that the fate of others is tied to the fate of their side. And so if people ended up, even innocents, didn't end up fleeing, you can't blame the IDF for that. Where in the world does Rabbi Goren get this idea from? So I don't want to get into all the weeds here, but there's a very interesting rabbinic position. It's taken in the 2nd century CE. Okay, 2nd century CE is after the fall of Jerusalem. It is after the fall of what's known as the Bar Kokhba rebellion. meaning the rebellion of the Jews trying to recapture some form of control over Judea. The Jews don't have power in this period. And there's a sage by the name of Rabbi Natan who says, when you lay siege, leave a fourth side open. And the question is, why? Like, why would you do this? And Maimonides says, well, the medieval commentator, there's a tradition that we have that we believe in this. But Nachmanides, the Ramban on the right side here, says, we were commanded that when we lay siege on a city to leave one direction open so if they want to flee, they can do so. From this, we learn to act with compassion even toward our enemies at the time of war. Meaning what Nachmanides is saying is that built into this law is to teach us that even when you're in the midst of war, you gotta show compassion. That's rationale number one. Rationale number two is actually very interesting. Let's think about it for a moment. If you were laying siege on Scranton, okay? I don't know why anyone lays siege on Scranton, but let's say you're laying siege on Scranton. And you then said to people, you know what? We'll leave you a side open. What might people do? They might run for their lives because I don't care enough about Scranton that I'm not picking on Scranton, to Houston, whatever it might be, right? I don't care about that enough, I'll run for my lives. But if you don't let people flee, then what will they do? Fight. Why? Nothing else to do. You might as well fight to the bitter end. And so he suggests as well that there's a military strategic element to this as well. If you create an evacuation corridor, it's easier to conquer the city because people won't fight to the bitter end. So there's a military element of this, and there's a humanitarian element of this law as well. Now, where does he get this idea from? Like, who fights wars this way? So here's my theory. Jews, if you know the Bible, know something about sieges. Okay? How do we know about sieges in the Bible? Okay, so the Israelites lay siege on Jericho and other places, but the Israelites in the Bible also suffer greatly from sieges. Okay, if you take a look in the book of Lamentations, which is read once a year by Jews throughout the world on the holiday or the fast day of Tisha B'Av, it commemorates the falling of the city of Jerusalem in the times of the First Temple, 586 BCE. And there we are told about the hunger, the starvation, the dire straits of the Jewish people, of the Israelites, in Jerusalem, who didn't recognize each other anymore, and their faces are blacker than soot, and they had no food, and they are embracing the garbage heaps. And it even goes to the point of saying, better off were the slain of the sword than those slain by famine. Meaning, it would be better to die in war quickly than to die painfully through a siege, through hunger. And we know this in Jewish history, not only from the first temple's destruction, but from the second temple's destruction, once again in Jerusalem, in 70 CE. And here we have a record from the book of Josephus, and where he discusses this and tells a story of a woman who doesn't just eat the flesh of a dead child, but actually kills her child to eat the flesh of the child. That's a horrible story. And the Roman soldiers laying siege around Jerusalem hear about it. And they say, wow, that's terrible. And they go to Caesar and they say to Caesar, look what you do. And Caesar says, it's not my fault. Why isn't it my fault? Because I offer them to surrender. And they chose not to surrender. So whose responsibility is it now for the fact that they're starving? It's on them. I proposed peace. They chose war. I proposed to them satiety and abundance. They chose a famine. What is Caesar basically saying? Once war begins, all is fair in love and war. It's not my issue. So here's my thesis, which I cannot prove to you, but I believe to be true. Rabbi Natan, in the 2nd century CE, who has seen the horrors of sieges of Jerusalem, and says Jews know very well what it means to starve and suffer under a siege, says if Jews ever get power again, don't be like Caesar. Not just before a war, but even once a war begins, have mercy on the enemy and try to minimize casualties. Leave the fourth side open. I can't prove to you that this is the case, but I believe, at least if this wasn't the intent, it is certainly the effect. That he's saying that we learn from Jewish history the principle of having mercy, which means try to minimize casualties. But as Professor Shapiro mentioned in his introduction, how many times since the 2nd century did Jews lay siege? I don't think they ever did until 1982. And so Rabbi Goren gets up and says, this is a great law, a principle. Have mercy. We care about minimizing civilian casualties. This is a great sanctification in the name of God. And this is what happens. If you look on one picture here in July 12, 1982, you have a picture of Arafat. He's the man with a little cap on over here. You can see that his terrorists or soldiers, I'm going to call them, are in a civilian area. You can see the advertisement on the right side here, and he's looking at them in artillery. And this is a famous picture when the Reagan administration negotiates a ceasefire. The snipers, the IDF snipers, had him in sight, and they don't shoot because they keep to the deal. But friends, I told you this is a tale of two sieges. And here's where things get complicated. Because Arafat leaves, and he goes originally to North Africa. To make a long story short, there's a civil war that breaks out in Lebanon. Things get very complicated. The Marines show up. The Marine barracks are bombed. 200 plus soldiers are killed. A lot's going on. Arafat and his men come back to Lebanon, and they're being surrounded in the city of Tripoli. Tripoli is in further northern Lebanon. And they're being surrounded on most sides, actually, by Arab rebels against the PLO. But for whatever reason, there's a bombing in Jerusalem, and IDF decides to lay a siege also on the water, so that way Arafat can't flee again. And the Reagan administration decides to try to negotiate once again and says, listen, we got to stop the civil war here. And they force the Israeli government to open up the siege and let Arafat and his men leave. And Rabbi Yisraeli, who remember before and said earlier, you should have created that evacuation corridor in the first place, gets up and says, yes, we care about civilian casualties, but when you fight war, you have to fight war quickly and decisively. And if you mess around and don't do this, then what ends up happening is your enemies come back to fight you. What are you fighting war if you're not going to fight it decisively to win the war? And there's another rabbi of great military distinction who himself was involved in many, many Israeli military incidents, who gets up after the siege of Tripoli and after the IDF lets the fourth side open and lets Arafat and his men leave again. And he says, I can't believe it. It's unfortunate that when they were already in the state beyond despair, our Navy opened the rings of the siege. We didn't conduct the entire siege. This law that states that one should not surround the city from all four sides in order to leave a place apparently only applies to war of conquest, or it might be, but it didn't apply in this circumstance. Which rabbi do you think said, leave, don't, it's a terrible thing that we left the fourth side open. We should have hermetically created a siege. None other than Rabbi Shlomo Brody. The same rabbi who 16 months earlier said it's an absolute obligation to create an evacuation corridor, all of a sudden says, no, that was a mistake. Why? I think what we're seeing here is the following. Rabbi Goren and others are struggling with the balance of many, many values. And the values on the one hand are, we believe as Jews that all humans were created in the image of God. And therefore we should mourn the loss of lives. And we don't want to see humans killed. And we certainly don't want to see non-combatants killed. And we believe in a purified and a better world and the restoration of the world. But we also understand that sometimes war is necessary. And when it is necessary, there's an element of a collective element that cannot be avoided. And so when you go to war to try to protect your people, you better fight it in a way in which it actually eliminates the threats. And while, of course, we're going to try to take decisions and moves to minimize civilian casualties, because we don't want non-combatants dying, sometimes, if you don't fight decisively, you end up being in a situation in which you actually don't accomplish anything in the war. You don't protect your own people. And so what I try to lay out in the book and other places in many situations is to set up principles, a framework of multiple principles, which I think should govern the way we think about military ethics and the issues particularly of civilian casualties. On the one hand, we recognize humans are created in the image of God. There's an inherent wrong of illicit bloodshed. We don't want to kill people who are non-combatants because they're people claiming to be in the name of their people fight in their midst. Right? The fact that Arafat decides to fight in a civilian neighborhood of Beirut doesn't mean we want to kill people. At the same time, we have an obligation to defend ourselves, to remove the evil threats against us, and we recognize the fact that there is a warfare is of a collective nature. And in such a circumstance, if you don't, as Rabbi Israeli pointed out, actually take care of the threat, all you're doing is extending long wars and not accomplishing anything to bringing about peace. And so you're going to be balancing multiple values when you think about these issues. Now, I hope for many of us here, this actually sounds intuitive. And you might be thinking, well, why is this novel? Yeah, okay, that makes sense. A lot of the values we're talking about make sense. You're balancing this or that. So I wanted to tell you that I think that much of the ethical discourse today in the West is full of fundamentalists. What do I mean by fundamentalist? So normally we think about fundamentalists are people, which include, by the way, some Jews, including in Israel. I'm not hiding that. There's some definitely people like this, who basically think that there's a fundamentalism, which I consider to be a fundamentalism, which means we care about one value. That's how I define a fundamentalist. What's the one value they care about? Protect your people. Defeat the enemy. It's the only thing that matters. And everything else is irrelevant. And certainly those types of fundamentalists scare me. I see it in the Middle East. Right? You see it in Hamas, you see it in Hezbollah, you see it in ISIS, Al-Qaeda, whatever it might be. Those are the types of fundamentalists that are very scary. But I want to also say that I think that there's another type of fundamentalism. And I'm not equating the two. Because before I mention who I'm going to call a fundamentalist, I want to be very clear. I am not equating the two at all. But there's another type of fundamentalism out there, which says all we should care about is one value, and that value is of individual human rights. And if somehow someone's individual rights are being violated, then whatever you are doing for whatever rationale might be is illegitimate. Any Canadians in the house? No Canadians? Oh, fantastic. So, Canada is now about to have elections, but throughout this current war, it's been led by a man by the name of Justin Trudeau. And Justin Trudeau had a number of lines which I didn't like, but here's one of the things he said in November 2023. I urge the government of Israel to exercise maximum restraint. The world is watching. On TV, on social media, we're hearing the testimonies of doctors, family members, survivors, kids who lost their parents. The world is witnessing this killing of women, of children, of babies. This has to stop. What is wrong with this statement? It is true that these pictures are horrible. It's sad, it's tragic, it's regrettable. But pictures tell you nothing about the ethics of what was going on. Why are these children or women being tragically killed? Because there's an ongoing war, which has a just cause of defending people, And in that context, you have to keep in mind multiple values. And some of those values include the fact that you need to remove the threat. And you need to pursue warfare, in some cases, defend yourself and to remove the threats from your midst. And by its nature, warfare is collective. And it is impossible to fight war, but particularly these types of war, asymmetric warfare, in urban settings, as it was in 82 in Beirut, and as other places, without non-combatants being killed. And so if you think that if you see killing of women, of children, it has to stop, then you can't fight a war, and you cannot defend your people. Or look at Macron, what he said. We do share Israel's pain. We do share their willingness to get rid of terrorism. We know what terrorism means in France. By the way, I mean, it's been a long time since like the 1960s in Algeria. Like what terrorism exactly is France doing? Whatever, okay? Leave that aside for a moment. De facto today, civilians are being bombed de facto. Well, it actually matters. Are you targeting the civilians? Or are you not targeting civilians? De facto, they're being killed, which is sad. But there's no reason for that, no legitimacy? Again, if you're dealing with multiple values and you're balancing multiple values, you're going to unfortunately end up sometimes with civilian casualties. That doesn't mean it's tragic. That doesn't mean that it's not something we want to avoid. Of course it's tragic. And so of course we want to avoid. But sometimes these things are going to happen. And so there's a certain amount of fundamentalism that has developed in the West today of not recognizing multiple values in thinking about the ethics of war. And in my mind, this is a very scary phenomenon. And I ask you, why has this happened? Now, I think partly, as I mentioned before, it's because the West doesn't fight wars on its own territory. Some of you have computers here. Do a quick Wikipedia search. Armed conflict in Canada. What do you come up with? Okay, you'll see 2/3 of armed conflicts in Canada relate to labor disputes. 1/3 deal with riots after Stanley Cup victories. I'm only being partly joking, right? You'll look there, right? You'll see. Meaning, when was the last time anyone in Canada was worried about someone on their border shooting a rocket into their home? When was any time someone in Scranton or New York or Houston was worried about that? And with all due respect to Macron and his fight against terror, how afraid are they of that in France? So part of what has happened is that people have lost sight of the fact of what it means actually to fight wars. But I think part of this, and with this I'll conclude, is that there's been a certain amount of a fundamentalism which says we care about one value alone. And war, like many, many other areas of ethics, is more complex than that. And it necessitates a multi-value framework for thinking of some of these issues. And my fear is that if we don't understand this, we won't be able to address some of the deep ethical questions that come up, both today and in the past. This is in Iraq, this is in Afghanistan, this is in Gaza, and this is in many, many other conflicts as well. If you don't think in terms of a multi-value framework, then you don't understand the complexity of how to deal with these issues. And it's my belief that if we don't develop the moral fortitude, I'm not only talking about physical fortitude, but the moral fortitude of dealing with the dilemmas of warfare, we're going to have a very, very hard time in fighting just wars. And so I hope that this tale of two sieges shows us is a development of trying to develop a complex moral framework of thinking about the issues that we face when we think about the ethics of war. Turn over to you now.
We're going to hear a Catholic perspective from Dr. Clark.
Thank you very much for your talk, Rabbi Brody, and also for your recent book, Ethics of Our Fighters, Jewish View on War and Morality, both of which are outstanding models of how to bring theological tradition and insights to bear upon an issue of pressing significance in both an intellectually rigorous and deeply thoughtful way. In doing so, you reveal how much a robust and vibrant tradition of theological ethics can contribute to the ongoing discourse and debate over war in today's world, and not only for those within that tradition, but for those of other and perhaps related traditions as well. In my response, I'm not going to engage directly with the analysis or specific conclusions presented in this particular case. Perhaps that might come up in the Q&A. But rather, my aim will be to step back a little and give a broader account of the Christian and specifically Catholic perspective on the ethics of war, with the aim of sketching out areas where our respective moral traditions might converge in substance or method, and also points where the two might diverge in their conceptual or historical viewpoint. About a decade ago, when I mentioned to my uncle Bob that I was teaching a course on war ethics, he had a revealing response. "I didn't know there was such a thing," he said. "I didn't realize you could teach a university course on an oxymoron." My sense is that Uncle Bob's response might not be all that unusual in the broader society. The idea that war could really have anything to do with ethics seems to many to be far-fetched or hopelessly naive. But regardless of however many failings we perceive in the way war is waged in the world today, it remains vitally important that we continue to subject military activity to serious moral scrutiny and that we take the findings of our examination seriously. For war is and will continue to be a part of human history, the side of the eschaton, and whether we can condemn it in part or in toto, we need to be able to articulately and persuasively explain why we do so. To neglect this task is to already cede the field to those who would prefer to wage war without any moral limits whatsoever. And to this end of reinvigorating serious public discourse around the ethics of war, Rabbi Brody has made a very important contribution with his book and performed a great service. So my course, taught about 10 years ago, was entitled War in the Christian Tradition, and it dealt with how war was portrayed and evaluated in sacred scripture, theological thought, political theory, and historical texts. It progressively converged on the main principles and ideals of war ethics in the Christian tradition, namely those of just war theory and Christian pacifism. And then we led students to apply and discern these principles and ideas in specific historical cases and even in the present. And as a part of this course, we also hosted 3 guest speakers who were active service members in the U.S. Army. They were here as recruiters. And when we asked them of their experience of ethics in war, in Iraq specifically, their answer was very simple. ROE, rules of engagement. Before every operation, they were apprised of the current parameters of what they could do or not do, with a special emphasis on what they could not do. Red lines they were under orders not to cross. And when asked about just war theory or criteria, their knowledge turned out to be very thin indeed. For them, just war theory might influence or inform decision makers higher up the chain of command, but it had little to no relevance to what they did or did not do on the battlefield. In other words, there was little sense that their combat should be governed by ethical commitments that either they themselves professed, which would be territory for conscientious objection, or that we as a people presume to hold in common. So this deeper sense of moral commitment is what tradition, particularly theological tradition, can bring to military ethics. Ethics within a tradition, particularly a theological tradition, can address foundational questions that go far deeper than what we are permitted or not permitted to do. Such traditions deal with fundamental ethical questions. What is human flourishing or fulfillment? What sorts of actions lead to it? Such questions presuppose anthropological questions. What sort of beings are we? What's the meaning, value, and purpose of our existence? And those in turn lead back to metaphysical and cosmological questions. What is the ultimate nature of reality? What sort of world do we inhabit? Religious, theological traditions are uniquely equipped to address these questions and so provide a stable foundation for ethical analysis of concrete issues, developments, and challenges that appear before us. Such traditions also provide a robust historical perspective comprising a communal memory of both past experiences as well as the cumulative moral wisdom gleaned in light of those experiences. One of the primary goals of a moral tradition, then, is to properly situate the present within the frameworks provided by the past, both in terms of experience and thought. And Rabbi Brody's analysis of the ethics of siege warfare, his larger body of thought on military ethics, is an exceptional example of what it looks like to undertake moral reflection in light of a sustained, coherent, and vibrant tradition. But although it remains largely implicit in his work, one senses in his careful curation and critical examination of authoritative sources what is perhaps the deepest and most urgent function of tradition-based ethics. That is, to navigate the practical exigencies of practical decision-making and concrete action in the present moment without forgetting who we are as a people belonging to a tradition that has formed us. To lose the identity and purpose provided by tradition is in a very real way to lose one's very self, or to put it in terms provided by my own tradition, to forfeit one's soul. The stakes of tradition-informed moral reflections are no higher than when it comes to the ethical evaluation of war. For here, one most clearly faces the stark reality that preserving one's identity comes at a cost that in some circumstances may even appear to threaten the viability of the community that bears one's tradition through time. At this point, let me venture to identify a common underlying moral commitment shared by Jewish and Christian traditions, namely the ultimate value of one's relation to God. The many stories of Christian martyrs and Jewish kedoshim at least give witness to a common conviction that there are some goods and values higher than mere survival, the highest of which is fidelity to God. Our relation to God is the deepest source of our identity. Everything else, in one way or another, is ordered and subordinated to that sovereign good. And when it comes to war, prioritizing this kind of fidelity can and often does seem to come at a cost, both to oneself and to those one is seeking to defend. But why pay such a cost if it seems to endanger the life of the people, the very subject of covenantal relationship, without which there would be no covenantal relationship? It seems to me inescapable that the conviction that fidelity to God stands above and before any worldly benefit can only be sustained by foundational universal claims about the nature, structure, and ultimate end of reality taken as a whole. In 1963, shortly after, perhaps in response to the Cuban Missile Crisis of the previous year, Pope St. John XXIII published a social encyclical he entitled Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth. One might have reasonably expected it to begin by recounting how close the world had just come to full-scale nuclear conflagration, and to use that terrifying incident as an occasion to urgently exhort the world once again to undertake renewed efforts to de-escalate tensions, engage in dialogue, and disarm. And he does eventually make such exhortations, but it's not until paragraph 109, and all told, he devotes only 11 of the encyclical's 172 paragraphs to the arms race and the threat of nuclear war. He begins rather with these words: peace on earth, which man through the ages has so longed for and sought after, can never be established, never guaranteed, except by the diligent observance of the divinely established order. What follows then is a remarkably systematic and articulated description of that order and how it informs worldly relationships at every level. The order inhering in the universe as a whole, the order pertaining to relationships between individual persons, the order governing relations between individuals and the state, the order proper to the relations between states, and the order of individuals and communities in relation to the world community as a whole. Whatever you make of Pope John's claims at each of these levels, what's remarkable is how deeply he roots his analysis within the worldview and framework of the Christian theological tradition, which informs not only his particular conclusions on this or that issue, but the moral, anthropological, and metaphysical context that ultimately grounds such conclusions and lends them coherence. Though he does not include the quote directly, Pope John clearly takes his cue here from St. Augustine, who regards peace not merely as the absence of war, but as the quote, tranquility of order. This ideal may sound utopian at first glance, but it is rooted in a deep claim about creation, which I believe Christians and Jews share, that despite the distorting effect of human sin, creation itself is not random, meaningless, or inherently conflictual. It's easy enough to deny this conclusion when one looks at all the conflict and violence in the world, both in nature and among humans. Indeed, many ancient origin stories, such as Enuma Elish and the cosmogony, characterize the process of creation as the result of war, and hence depict creation itself as an expression of violence. But if it is true that war is at the heart of reality, then it would seem indeed that war ethics is an oxymoron. But those who proclaim the truth of the biblical creation account, however, maintain that reality at its core is an expression of divine order, proceeding from peace and ultimately ordered to the sort of peace God himself enjoys after his creative work is finished. This peace, this right order, should be the goal of every earthly activity, every human decision, and every course of action. The Christian theological tradition, therefore, insists that even war must ultimately aim at peace. St. Augustine explains in his letter to Boniface, it is not the case that peace is sought in order that war might be waged, rather war is waged in order that peace might be acquired. He then adds, therefore, be peaceful in warring, in order that by subduing those whom you are fighting against, you might lead them out to the benefits of peace. Perhaps it's an obvious point that the aim of war should be peace. Nobody, after all, not even the Spartans, sought to be in a perpetual state of war. War is, in Karl von Clausewitz's famous phrase, politics by another means. It seeks to bring about a state of affairs that is better, at least more acceptable than that which preceded the war. Yet Augustine's point, reflecting the perennial teaching of the Christian tradition, is deeper than that. Peace is not merely the cessation of war, nor is peace merely the state of affairs resulting from the submission of one belligerent to the demands of another. Still less is it the eradication of one belligerent by another, a la Tacitus's quip, "They make a desert and call it peace." Peace is the restoration of right order, involving first and most immediately the rectification of injustice, social disorder between peoples, which cannot but then be determined in light of a broader order inscribed into creation itself, which finds its apex in humanity's relation to God. In the eyes of the true worshippers of God, Augustine says elsewhere, those wars are peaceful, which are waged not out of disordered desire, out of cruelty, but with a zeal for peace, so that evil men might be restrained and good men might be lifted up. The Catholic moral tradition teaches that the love of God, charity, is the virtue which governs all other virtues and is indeed the goal and culmination of human life. Charity is what unites us to God, and so it enables our ultimate fulfillment. This union with God should be our first and highest priority. Charity is the virtue that puts us in right relation, or right order with God. Yet charity also orders and informs our relationships to one another, and indeed to all others. Christians are not commanded never to have enemies, but they are called to love their enemies. That does not mean that Christians may never enter into conflict with their enemies, however. Yet it does mean that this conflict must, like every other action, be animated and directed by the virtue of charity. That leads to a somewhat paradoxical sounding conclusion, especially in our own day. Even in war, Christians are called to exercise charity. Their engagement in war must itself be a manifestation of love. And this love must be directed not only toward those whom one is defending, but also toward one's enemy as well. Even a Catholic might be surprised to find that St. Thomas Aquinas presents his account of just war, a major source in the Christian tradition, within his treatise on charity in the Summa Theologiae. War is initially categorized as a vice opposed to charity, a reminder that war is not natural, but a symptom of some underlying disorder. Yet unlike other vices opposed to charity, such as sedition or envy, Aquinas allows that engagement in war can be just, which is confusing because there's no such thing as virtuous envy, or we might call that admiration. There's no such thing as just sedition. We might call that revolution, but we wouldn't apply a good title to those vices. But there is just war, which at least raises the question, what do we call a war when it's not just? An unfortunate war, an immoral war, or is there another word for it? What would differentiate it from murder or slaughter? The moral ambivalence of the term itself is an obstacle and risks abuse. This ambivalence and its potential for abuse is at least a reminder of the high stakes involved in determining whether a war is or is not in fact just. Just very quickly, Aquinas famously lays out three conditions for a just war. It's brought about through a legitimate ruler or proper authority. The individuals can't just start wars. It needs a just cause. Those attacked must be at fault for some injustice. And right intention, that one waging war must seek to promote the good and avoid evil. The Catholic tradition will later apply the principle of proportionality to war in relation to both the ethical considerations leading up to war, jus ad bellum, as well as considerations within war, jus in bello. Before war, proportionality determines whether the offense or injustice in question warrants risking the destruction and other evils typically caused by war. It's often possible that a community must suffer injustice rather than go to war, if it's clear that waging war would constitute an even greater injustice. Other considerations naturally follow, like have all other options for redressing the injustice been exhausted? That's last resort. Is there a reasonable chance the war will succeed? So even if you have the best cause in the world, you're not sending one soldier up against 10,000. During the war, jus in bello, proportionality applies along roughly the same lines as it would in the case of justified self-defense. A community should only use as much force as is necessary to repel the aggressor or subdue the enemy. And part of this consideration is the foreseen endangerment or death of people who are not directly involved in combat. While one may not directly intend the death of non-combatants, the effects of one's use of force the effect that use of force will have on non-combatants must factor into one's determination of what constitutes the minimal level of force needed to repel or subdue the enemy. So it's a question of necessity. Relatively recently, Christians reflecting on these issues have also considered a third category of just war criteria, jus post bellum, justice after war. Is one's military objective and conditions for surrender clear to the enemy? What obligations, if any, does a nation have to its enemy once hostilities have ceased? And what means, if any, should be sought to bring about moral political reconciliation? So the proximate end of war is justice, which is the restoration of what is owed or due the parties involved in the conflict, but the ultimate end of war is peace. Justice is a cause for peace, but only indirectly, says Aquinas, since justice in this instance is really about the removal of obstacles to charity, but only the achievement of charity can be the direct cause of peace, Aquinas maintains. But he insists, along with Augustine, that only wars consistent with charity can result in true peace, because only charity can unite us to God, and that union is the goal of our existence and the end in which our ultimate fulfillment resides. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a few questions from the audience. Yes. Well, that microphone's on too. Oh, you can do this one too. Oh, you're the audience, yes, you get it, and you can answer with that microphone. You have to turn it on though. You turn it on? Okay.
Thank you both. That was very interesting and informative.
It's on, it's on. It's on.
Oh. I want to thank the Academy. Okay. But I have a question I'm a little reluctant at first to ask. So I wanted Dr. Clark. I look at the Crusades. Now, here is a war where, and I'm oversimplifying this, let's say the Christians are going to the Holy Land to eliminate the Muslim control over the Holy Land. Why are they massacring Jews on the way? And why did they? And why was that acceptable and an appropriate act of conduct for which there was nothing but, I think, positive response?
Well, I suppose that's a case of principle versus reality. Maybe one point might help reveal this. The most well-known commentator of St. Thomas Aquinas, Cardinal Cajetan, has a footnote about just cause in this part of his Summa commentary. And he even goes so far as to say, if the Pope, who's meant to be the vicar of Christ, the representation of Christ in the world, the head of the church, if his declaration is deemed to be unjust, then it's actually a sin to go to war and follow the orders of leaders. So it doesn't really matter, and it kind of makes sense. It doesn't really matter like what the official policy is or who set out the official policy. If it is unjust, or if it's disordered, or if it's going to lead toward discord, then it's not just a just war. And there have been many wars that have been approved by the church in the past that have since been deemed to be clearly unjust. Pope John Paul II, I think, is the most well known for having recognized, confronted these, and apologized for them. But there's no guarantee, no matter what your state of what your position in the church is, or the official policy of the Christian faith, that it's going to be a just war.
Let me just follow up before I take other questions. I'm just curious, what does current Catholic teaching say? Forget about this, what happened with the Jews on the way, but the actual crusade itself. From the Muslim perspective, that itself was immoral. Christians coming to an area where they didn't belong. I mean, is there any teaching that you know of today that says the actual crusades themselves were an unfortunate mistake theologically?
I don't know offhand whether there are any official statements. I mean, at the level of beliefs or tenets, one wouldn't get into that level of historical analysis. But I can say that the current teaching, as it's laid out in the Catechism and in the more recent teachings of the Church, basically takes somewhat of a communal self-defense view. That anything that's justified in individual self-defense would be justified on the communal level for that same reason. This is the logic applied to the very, very minimal instance of where capital punishment might be justified, where someone is actively threatening the life of the community. There's no way to restrain them. So it's really kind of an act of war in a way. But that would be the only case right now in current teaching where war would be justified as an act of justified
I
self-defense.
might think there might be a difference between, let's say, Christian invasion of Spain to push back the Muslims versus the
Right.
going to the Holy Land.
Right.
Yes.
My question will primarily be for Shlomo. I understand in your description of Beirut, mostly, and then Tripoli a little bit, the main point you were making there was the proximity of civilians to military targets as a justification or a description of why it may or may not be acceptable. So given that argument, I'd like to ask you about Hamas. Based on the standard of ethics you seem to be employing there, a country like Israel required military service, where nearly everybody will or does serve in the military. The category of civilians seems entirely erased from what you described. So to me, in one historical example, that sort of justifies Hamas's attacks, unless you can argue otherwise. But in a more potential example, if we're dealing with physical targets, and a more, entirely hypothetical example, the Israeli military has been responsible for killing a number of people, which, as most militaries are. The headquarters is located in Tel Aviv, right next door to a very large mall that maybe you've been to before. So if Hamas had the kind of weaponry that someone like Israel has, like a 2,000-pound bomb, then the target itself would be justified, but the civilians nearby would still be justified in the way you're describing it?
Thank you for the question. So what I was trying to lay out with regard to Beirut is the balance of different values that we're going to bring to the table in terms of it. It's not just, the part I was trying to get to is as follows. The desire to avoid non-combatants needs to be genuine and real. And I think there's a real deep theological basis for that. And I think that's what the amazing example that Rabbi Goren was trying to exemplify, is to say, create that evacuation corridor, get people out, right? And that's part of the principle here. We have a value about how to try to minimize civilian casualties. And in every war, that's going to look a little differently in terms of how this looks, right? Now, the question that you're raising is a broader one, which is, well, how do you exactly define who's a civilian and who's and civilian isn't really a relevant term as much as who's a combatant and who's a non-combatant. I think that's a very, very important question. Historically, traditionally, it was easier to identify who wears a uniform, right? So who's a part of that? That makes them a combatant. No one's born a combatant, right? So they're only, when they become a uniform, they become enlisted. Terrorist groups or guerrilla warfare, or however you want to call people in different circumstances, complicates that because they don't wear uniforms and the lines get very fuzzy in terms of that. My own belief is that people are actively engaged in supporting the active military cause at that moment become combatants, whether or not they put on a uniform or not. Okay, that means sometimes civilians can have a combatant role because, let's say, they're working in a lab directly for the military, whoever it is. And sometimes, but most times, civilians aren't in that situation. Now, that's why, in terms of when you think about Hamas, let's say, or in the PLO, in the case of Beirut, so the people that are actively involved in being a part of what others deem as terror attacks, they might find as revolutionary fighters, whoever it might be, are combatants. Now, in the case of the ID, in Israel, or for that matter, in Gaza, whatever it might be, there are many people who might be future soldiers. They might be very sympathetic, right, to the cause. But that doesn't make them combatants at this point. So you're right. My son is 17. He's going to be in the Army in 2 years from now. That doesn't make him a legitimate target at this point, even though he gets up at 6 a.m. to go train on sand dunes, wherever it might be. Right now, he's not a combatant. The same way, and I tell this to my Israeli, neighbors all the time, the fact that someone in Gaza might be very, very supportive of Hamas activities, might be cheering them on, might be praying for them, might be providing sandwiches, whatever it might be, doesn't make them a combatant. And none of those people should be targeted. That should be the policy. I hope that's the policy of the IDF. I believe that is the policy of the IDF. They're not combatants. I might think they have wrong values, the same way they might think I have wrong values, right? But that doesn't make them a combatant. And so I think it's very, very important to distinguish between those who sympathize with a cause with those who are actually directly engaged in military activities at that point. Terrorist groups and asymmetric warfare in general blurs that lines and makes it very, very difficult. But we should try to preserve that line as much as possible, precisely because of the factors of the balancing of values they mentioned earlier. You asked about in terms of the bunker. The Israeli, defense ministry has an area called the Kiryah in Tel Aviv, which is not far from a mall. And you're right, if they were targeting that military target and there was collateral damage in the nearby Israeli mall, it'd be legitimate. Right?
I just wanted to follow up. We're going to have the last question will be Julie, but you keep saying combatants. I have to ask you about something. Michael Walzer, who is, wrote the standard book, Just and Unjust Wars, and he's a supporter of Israel's war. But he also said, that the bombing, the pagers against Hezbollah terrorists, which most people think would be perfectly legitimate, it doesn't affect civilians, almost very rarely affected civilians. He said that that's a war crime because at the moment they were not combatants. They were going to the supermarket. They were doing this. It seems that your argument could also lead into Walzer's conclusion, which strikes many people as counterintuitive.
I think Walzer was totally wrong on that. Yeah. Actually, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about it, and my letters was published in the New York Times in response to that. That's a good example of someone who, the beeper attack they're referring to, Israel. So the Mossad set up a situation where the beepers being used by Hezbollah had bombs in them. And so they were able to set it off. And Walter claimed, but at that moment, you don't know if they were fighting or not. But they weren't holding those beepers to get, Yankees updates. Right? They're holding those beepers to get operational orders. So if you're holding a beeper because you're a member of a terrorist group or Hezbollah, however you want to define it, for the sake of it's a part of their communications.
So even at home at 2 a.m. at home with their family,
if they're using it. Now, if they were just having on their radio to listen to Hezbollah updates because they want to know what's going on, the Hezbollah YouTube channel, I'm making this up. I assume they have it though, right? So no, anyone who's watching the Hezbollah YouTube channel doesn't become a combatant. Someone who has a communication device of an armed group for the sake of getting orders, that's a legitimate target. And unfortunately, it was a brilliant attack in my mind, which actually caused very minimal civilian damage. And this is exactly the point I was trying to get to earlier. People like Walzer, who you still have a lot of respect for, but even Leon Panetta. Leon Panetta was the former defense secretary of the United States and of the CIA, called it an act of terror. It's insane. It's just insane.
Does anyone else, will this be the last? No one else? Okay, so why don't we, this will be the last question.
Okay, so I just wanted to bring up Pope Francis passed away earlier this week, and he made many comments about Gaza and was very, just to recall a few, he called it immoral, he called it disproportionate, he called it an appalling harvest of civilians, and he also decried October 7th and always called for the release of Israeli hostages. One thing that neither of you brought up was international law, and the Catholic Church holds it in high regard. And of course, we know that it was invented after World War II, post-Holocaust. Today is, a commemoration of the Holocaust. So I would just like to hear a little bit about how the frameworks interact with international law, but specifically in relation to the withholding of humanitarian aid. So we have in the United States right now, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a fundamentalist, an Israeli fundamentalist, a Kahanist. And he said, just in the last couple days, that it is okay that food and aid depots should be bombed to create military and political pressure, And the Israeli defense minister, Israel Katz, said, Israel policy is clear, no humanitarian aid will enter Gaza. So how does this withholding of humanitarian aid, which has been longstanding, intersect with both of the moral frameworks and specifically with international law?
So there are about 7 questions, topics that are built into that question. But I'll try to be brief on it. International law, it was created after the Holocaust. It pre-existed, of course, World War II and the Holocaust, but many Jews in particular were deeply involved in creating the system. Hirsch Lauterpach, James Robinson, many others. The whole term genocide comes from a Jew in 1942 and whatnot. It is a failed system in practice. International law is a failed system, my belief, for a very simple reason. If no one is ever going to be prosecuted in Russia or Ukraine or Syria or Ethiopia or Sudan or any other place, if only place you're going to apply international legal standards, by the way, no one is ever going to be prosecuted by the ICC in the American Army or the British Army as well. So if no one in America or Britain or Syria or Ukraine or Russia or Uzbekistan or Azerbaijan or Sudan or Ethiopia is going to be prosecuted under the ICC, and the only ones that are going to be prosecuted by the ICC are people in Africa and Israelis, which is basically the track record, that is a deeply, deeply problematic system. So in theory, it's a nice idea, the ICC and all this stuff. I don't hold of the moral standing of the system too much. There are moral ideas in international law, but the moral standing of the system, in my mind, is deeply flawed. By the way, the most important conventions that people invoke today, the additional protocols of Geneva Conventions in 1977, were not signed by either Israel or the United States, and Britain and many other countries signed on many years later with many provisos and caveats to it. It's not a system. It's become deeply politicized, and I don't respect it as a system in its own right of being of value. In the book, I discussed that there are actually a number of rabbis who felt that if it was going to be observed and followed well, then yeah, international law is a great system. It's a great thing. It's a blessed invention. In practice, I don't think it's worked out so well. I see by your look you don't agree, but that's where I stand on this issue. In terms of the humanitarian aid, of course, as I mentioned earlier, when you balance the values, you don't want non-combatants to suffer. And so the fact that non-combatants shouldn't have food is a terrible thing. I mean, if you look at the stories of the Book of Lamentations I quoted earlier, right? That teaches us we shouldn't have a situation where people are starving to death. But, even in international legal conventions, when it comes to these issues, one of the issues that gets raised is the following. If the humanitarian aid is going to be utilized by the combatants and taken over by the combatants, there's a big question in humanitarian law, whether it has to be international humanitarian law, whether it has to be provided. Now, in the case in Gaza, Israel initially said they weren't going to do it. In practice, they sent in a lot of humanitarian aid went in. You can argue enough, this or that, a lot of food went in. None of it went to, by the way, the Israeli hostages who are all starving to death. Right, which, just let's put that out there. But there's a lot of humanitarian aid that went in there. And the question becomes, though, is that since we now know that Hamas took much of that humanitarian aid for its own purposes, even under international law, it's not clear to me that Israel's required to do it. But, the question is, right, how do you balance the different values that we have here? It is a terrible, terrible thing to see people suffer by not having food. But if it means that that's the only pressure point that you're going to be able to do to try to get your hostages out and to end a war, you have to balance that. I hope that's not what it comes to.
Okay, well, I think we've gone long enough. Okay. So I thank you both very much. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you. Pleasure.